First of all, thanks very much for your time.
Absolutely, thanks for having me.
Tell us why Holland.
Sure. Sorry, should we wait for that guy to go past?
No, go.
Okay, is that okay?
We want the
All right.
action in the
You want
background.
the
We're all
action,
good.
all right,
Yeah. So
okay.
why the Netherlands?
Okay. So the reason we wanted to go to Holland or Netherlands is because we wanted essentially a neutral country and one with excellent shipping access. So obviously Holland has a great tradition of shipping and trade and excellent ports, and we really received a great welcome from the Dutch government and the people. So we thought, well, this seems like a really good place to have a base of operations. And in fact, we're moving our headquarters from London to, European headquarters from London to the Netherlands, as well as having the assembly plant in Tilburg. So we really do have a very significant presence in the Netherlands.
Why Tilburg? Well, I mean, that's the southern part. Why not do everything in around Rotterdam, Amsterdam area?
Yeah, we considered a number of locations, but it just happened that we found a place that really seemed to fit well in Tilburg. And we're looking at it from the standpoint of optimizing the logistics for access throughout Europe, because we'll be delivering, I think, as many cars in Europe as we deliver in North America. So we see Europe as at least as big a market as North America. So it's very important for us to be able to have excellent access particularly to continental Europe. And that's another reason why it makes sense to have our headquarters in continental Europe, because if we had it in say in the UK, then well, it'd be a bit silly, because we'd be building cars and then shipping them across the channel, and it makes much more sense to have it in Europe. And then, like I said, for logistics reasons, for the fact that we were very welcomed by the Dutch government and the people there, we all sort of sat around and said, okay, this really seems to be the most sensible way to go.
Good. How do you divide your time between Tesla, SpaceX, and Solar City?
I spend about half my time, well, my aspiration is to spend about half my time on Tesla and about half on SpaceX. I'm chairman of Solar City, but I don't run it day to day. In the last year or so, I've spent a majority of my time on Tesla, because it was important to complete the product and get the factory up and running, deal with the expansion of service and getting into multiple markets and that kind of thing. So for the last year or so, it's probably been 70% at Tesla, but on average, I try to split my time roughly evenly.
How do you do it?
I work a lot. It's been quite intense, I have to say, and I do want to maybe reduce my work time maybe by 10% or something like that. My New Year's resolution was to have more fun, because although there were a lot of achievements in prior years, and obviously it feels good in retrospect, it was extremely stressful and difficult at the time. So I'd like to just maybe work 10% less. I mean, I was doing 90 to 100 hours, so maybe 80 hours, which is not that much when you consider it's two companies. So that's only 40 hours a week each, if it's with 50-50. So,
and is that working out for you?
I'm getting there. I hope to be there by the end of the year.
Good. We last spoke. We've met before in I guess sort of in the infancy stage in Menlo Park briefly in 2008. And
okay. Wow. So you've obviously seen quite a bit of change.
I've seen the. Well, let's talk about that for the moment. We had talked back then about the economy of scale, and that the Roadster really was meant for the high-end user as your fourth or fifth car.
Right.
Work the economy of scale, much like the cell phone of presidents and CEOs of companies back in the 80s,
right.
And what they've. How far along the economy of scale are we 6 years down, 6 years later?
Well, going from the Roadster to the Model S, certainly we've made huge improvements in economies of scale, and that's allowed us to reduce the price while adding a great deal of functionality to the vehicle. But in addition, we've been able to optimize the technology. We've done a major design iteration with going from the Roadster to the Model S. With any new technology, in order for it to become accessible to the mass market, you really need to go through multiple iterations, multiple versions of the technology. It just takes a lot of engineering effort to design things for manufacturing. It's actually quite difficult. And then of course the economies of scale help enormously. You know, we're able to negotiate better deals with suppliers. We're able to distribute our fixed costs over a much larger volume of product. And so going from the Roadster to the Model S, we've effectively dropped the cost by about half, while at the same time adding a ton of additional functionality. And then going from the Model S to our third generation vehicle, which is probably 3 to 4 years from now, we hope to cut the price in half again. It'll be a bit of a smaller vehicle, and maybe not quite as many features coming as default. A way to think about third generation vehicle is a bit like maybe a BMW 3 Series or an Audi A4, whereas the Model S is like a BMW 5 to 7 Series or an Audi A7 or something like that.
You've paid off the, what is it, $465 million loan in an impressive 9 years ahead of schedule.
Yeah.
You know, partly because of, I guess, the rise in stock, also partly because of the excellent selling Model S in the first quarter. Sales are expected around 21,000 or so in this year, 2013.
Yeah, we expect,
can that early success rate maintain its course? Because I know that there's a vast difference between, let's say, the first quarter and at the end of the year, things happen to change. Do you expect that to continue?
No, actually, I expect that our volume will continue to increase quite a bit. In fact, our limitation right now is not demand, but supply. So, in fact, if someone wants to order a Model S for Europe, they need to place their order right away if they want it this year. Because if you place an order now, I think you get it maybe in November. So it's maybe a 4-month wait, and that's likely to increase. And the wait in the U.S. is actually going to get very long because up till June, all of our production was going to North America, and now we've allocated almost half of our production to Europe. So, what we're spending our time on right now is not trying to figure out how to increase demand, but we're trying to figure out how to increase production while maintaining high quality standards. That's our main challenge.
How did you get from producing 5 a month to now, I guess, 400 a month to whatever you can produce to meet the demand down the road?
Yeah, so we were at 400 a week, earlier this year, and now we're at around 500 to 550 a week. So we've increased actually by 20 to 30% even from the beginning of the year. By the end of this year, we're hopefully going to be above 600 a week, but that's dependent on supply constraints. So the thing that a lot of people don't, I mean, if you think about it, it's obvious, but a lot of people don't quite appreciate that there are several thousand unique components in a car, and even if one of those components cannot keep pace in production, then that limits your total production. It's sort of like an army only marches as fast as the slowest soldier, right? So, and sometimes it's the silliest things that limit production. I mean, at one point we had a production constraint due to carpet in the trunk. Okay, now that seems like a ridiculous thing, right? But let me tell you, if you deliver somebody a car with no carpet in the trunk, they're very unhappy. And so it goes all the way from silly things like that to limitations on the production of lithium-ion cells, to we had an aluminium limitation because there was a big spike in worldwide aluminium demand at one point. So it's really dealing with supply and production and logistics constraints that are what preoccupy my time at Tesla.
Obviously, the battery is paramount to your success and the improvement in technology.
The battery is the single most important thing, but it's not. It's always important to not overemphasize the battery. The battery is the single most important thing, but it's also extremely important to consider how efficient the car is. So the battery is like the bank account of sort of how much money you have, but then your standard of living is how well you spend that money. You know, it's both factors. You know, and so in the car, being very aerodynamically efficient and being light for the size of the car is extremely important. So that's why our car has an all aluminum body and chassis. We have the lowest drag coefficient of any car currently in production, our drivetrain is extremely efficient. You know, the motor, the inverter, the gearbox, and all that takes that energy from the battery pack and translates it into motion. All of those things are extremely important. And if you just focus on the battery pack and you don't take a great care on how efficiently the energy is used, then the range will be low. So you have to have both pieces.
We've seen already a drastic improvement in battery technology. I mean, when it first came out, I guess it was AC to DC. Now it's DC to DC. We're talking about supercharging stations. When do we see, you know, the next great increase in range, which maintains to this day, you know, the range anxiety is still in the back of people's minds? Sure.
Well, it's worth noting that the Model S, depending upon what speed you drive, has a usable range of up to about 300 miles, or essentially 450 to 500 kilometers. In fact, I'd say it's got a even at fairly high speeds, a useful range of around 400 kilometers. So that's not too bad. Then we've combined, as you alluded to, AC and DC. So whereas the Roadster could only take AC charging, the Model S actually has a high voltage junction box and can actually take DC through the same plug that feeds AC. It can take high voltage DC directly to the battery pack. And we've developed an advanced charging technology, which we call the supercharger, obviously reusing a word from the traditional automotive arena, that is able to charge at 120 kilowatts, which is a tremendous amount of power. To give a frame of reference, a typical house might use 2 kilowatts. So you're talking about 60 times a house power. So in order to do that, you have to do this complex, ultra high-speed electromagnetic dance, essentially, between the charger and the battery pack. And they have to the charger really needs to understand the battery pack and have a tight feedback loop. So it's always measuring the temperature and the current and making sure everything's done exactly right. That's what's needed in order to charge at that rate. But the net result is at 120 kilowatts, you can essentially charge up, call it 200 kilometers in like 20 minutes. So it's really pretty convenient.
Now it's, you know, the issue of charging stations.
Yeah.
You had talked about going coast to coast, and I live in New York. I see the East Coast not being an issue. I see obviously the West Coast not being an issue. How do you connect the dots? Where do we, when we want to drive a Tesla and go from coast to coast, have the one charging station in Kansas or in Oklahoma or somewhere in that big giant vastness of Midwest America, where they may say, what's it worth to us if we get one car a month that comes by here? Where do you connect those dots? How do you plan to allay the fears of a skeptical public that says, you know what, we're good to go coast to coast?
Sure. So Tesla is rapidly deploying the supercharging stations throughout North America, and we're beginning to deploy them in Europe as well. So by the end of this year, you'll be able to travel just using our supercharger network from north to south on the coasts, and from Los Angeles all the way to New York, and we'll have covered almost all the major metro areas. By the end of next year, we'll have probably 90% of the North American population covered with the supercharger network. So it's expanding very rapidly. And it's important to note that the Tesla Superchargers are and always will be free. So whenever you buy a Tesla Model S, you're actually buying the ability to travel long distance for free forever. And then we're putting solar panels on the supercharging locations so that they're powered by sunlight. And so essentially the catchphrase we use is drive for free forever on pure sunlight. And I think that's, doesn't get better than that. And we're deploying, as I mentioned, the first superchargers in Europe. The very first will actually be in Norway. We did that because Norway actually has the highest per capita, the highest per capita purchases of the Model S in the world. In fact, sometimes people have this question of how well does our car work in the cold? And it's like, well, you should ask the Norwegians, okay? They're very, in fact, a single, the individual who's bought more Teslas than anyone else in the world is a guy by the name of Jens Krudholm, who lives above the Arctic Circle in Norway and drives his car through the winter where it's permanent midnight. So he's great. But by the end of this year, we should have pretty widespread coverage of the supercharger in Europe, and by the end of next year, we should be able to travel almost anywhere in Western Europe using the Tesla supercharger network, also for free. And in Europe, it's going to make an even bigger difference because the cost of petroleum is so much higher than it is in the US.
Yep. Yep.
5 minutes before knowing it.
We're 15 minutes in, right?
About 20 minutes in.
All right. Last questions about Tesla.
Okay.
Some negative publicity has come out. One aspect. Second aspect is the problems with the dealerships. That's anyway. Answer it any way you want.
Europe is much more progressive than the U.S. In this regard. So in the U.S., there are these sort of these really highly restrictive laws that make it difficult for us to sell cars directly in certain states, and. But these laws are only present in the US, they're not present in Europe or Canada or Asia. So we don't anticipate any, and we haven't had any issues in Europe with direct sales. So I think it's somewhat parochial to the US on the dealer front.
And the whole New York Times thing, I know you've answered it a million times. Feel free to do your 30 seconds now.
I mean, I think that the New York Times thing is kind of water under the bridge at this point. But I think that there was a review that really was not up to the journalistic standards of the New York Times, and the actual review was contrary to the data logged by the car. So it was a fabricated article in the New York Times. It's not the first time it's happened. The New York Times has had this issue before. But obviously it happens in every newspaper at some point that you get reporters who write articles that are just not true. But the thing in the New York Times is there's a greater, since they hold themselves to a high standard, they should have held themselves to a higher standard in this article. Now the public editor of the New York Times did do a review and actually concluded that the article had been written, had factual errors. So ultimately they did a sort of a mea culpa, as much as their New York Times is capable of doing.
Talk about you for a moment. You were born in '71. What were the two things that influenced you the most, or were perhaps most important for you to look at life, to want to make fundamental changes? Could be, love for motorcycles. Could be, whatever it was. What were your things growing up that you thought, I want to do this differently?
Well, when I was growing up, I was always interested in technology and things that changed the world. So I wanted to be involved in creating exciting technology. And I read a lot of science fiction. And I read books about the future, and so I was thinking about, well, what's the future going to be like? What are the important technologies that we need to solve in order for the future to be positive? And that's where my interest comes from with Tesla and SpaceX and Solar City. It's very important for us to have sustainable energy production and consumption I think it's important that humanity become a spacefaring civilization and be out there exploring the stars, and of course, I mean, there are many other things that are important, advancements in the internet, in medicine, genetics, and all that. But the areas that I thought were really important, or most important in my view, were the internet, and then sustainable energy. Like if we don't solve sustainable energy, then tautologically we have a severe problem, and even without environmental consequences, we will face economic collapse, right? So, in fact, my initial interest in electric cars and solar was not environmentally driven, but rather from the standpoint of we must have a long-term solution for the production of energy, because mining and burning hydrocarbons is inherently short-term. We will run out. And then on the space front, I didn't actually think I'd be involved in anything related to space, but I kept thinking that there would be a next step after the Apollo program, that there'd be a base on the moon, that would be sending people to Mars, and every year I kept waiting for this to happen, and it didn't happen. So that's why I thought there has to be a new company that tries to make it happen.
Why is Mars so important to you?
Well, Mars is the only place where we can create a self-sustaining human civilization, in my opinion. The moon is close, but it's like the Arctic, and so even though the Arctic's close to Europe, why were the American colonies not formed in the Arctic? Because it sucks. It's not nice. So even though the Americas were far away, and it was a dangerous journey across the Atlantic, it still made much more sense to create New Amsterdam, in New York, than to try to create New Amsterdam in the Arctic, which, by the way, is not that far from the Netherlands. So you can practically walk there from Norway. Anyway, so you've got to have something that has the ultimate scalability to be a self-sustaining civilization and to become a true multi-planet species. I think that's important for the future of civilization in case there's if there's a worst case outcome on Earth. And by the way, I'm quite optimistic about the future of Earth. It's not as though I think. Yes, absolutely. Sometimes people misinterpret this as thinking like we need to escape to another planet. Like, no, we need to be multi-planetary. I didn't say single planetary, but a different planet. It's a multi.
Government and entrepreneurship, how should they be married? Because obviously what you're doing, you could not do without available government subsistence. But on the other hand, you are doing it the way you want to do it. You always have. So where's the happy medium between the two? And I'm thinking of things like Davos and things that are really encouraging people like yourselves to go out there.
Yeah, I guess it's worth pointing out that for the first several years for Tesla, we had no government assistance at all. That's maybe people don't realize that, and we had no government whatsoever help at all. Nothing, zero. And then we did get a government loan in which we received the first funding in 2010, and then we paid it off just recently. But we actually received by far the least amount of government funding of any car company, electric or otherwise. And we, I think, arguably did the most with the amount of money and paid it off first. The gasoline car companies received vastly more. I mean, GM, I don't know, they received $50–60 billion, some crazy amount of money.
Why, how much time?
You have 2 minutes.
How much Fisker failed, Leaf is teetering, the Volt is teetering. Why are you a success?
Well, I think it's important in any industry to have a compelling product at a reasonable price. So whether it's cars or anything else, the product itself has to be great. And in the case of the Fisker, they had issues with spontaneous combustion. It was very unreliable. The performance, it looked good, but the performance wasn't there. And I think this is reflective of the fact that Henrik Fisker is a stylist, but not an engineer. And so he didn't have a great respect for engineering and production. And he felt that those things were generic. And obviously, we believe in the value of aesthetics, but when you're talking about an advanced technology like an electric car, the core engineering is extremely important. And you have to propose like the bit for argument. So it's not, bit for styling. Would we have electric cars? No, it's not a styling problem. It's a technology problem. And so if you look at the underlying technology and say the Fisco, the Volt, the Leaf, it's not that great. That's at the heart of it.
I have a final question for you, and it's about you. Are you stubborn or impatient to get things done in the right way? In other words, you see something, you don't see it anywhere out there, you're going to do it yourself. Are you, I'm going to do this right? Are you impatient that if these things were happening and you didn't have to do it, would that be okay? How should we view you when it comes to this vision?
Patience is definitely not one of my virtues, I'd say. But I'm impatient, but I'm also somewhat of a perfectionist about all the details, both the visible things and the things that are hard to see. So I think probably my desire to be a perfectionist with respect to the product is greater than my impatience. So I would rather have a great, essentially I will not ship a bad product. I refuse to ship a bad product.